And all this to reflect about all kinds of initiatives regarding security, and I mentioned, for instance, this small arms weapon that we do together with Germany. There is also the support that we give to the Regional Youth Cooperation Office. So, I mean, I could quote you, and then I will come back to this in my stay in Belgrade, on a lot of different aspects of bilateral cooperation. The other aspect is, of course, as member of the EU, we are extremely committed to the EU perspective. And I want to make clear, but I think I cannot be clearer than my president himself, there is no question of do you reform first and then we'll come back to this, and after we've done our reform in the EU, we'll consider all that, which would be a desperate perspective, but this is not at all what we have said. What we have said is that both have to be conducted in parallel. And what it means is that what we are aiming at in an EU that works better, it's not the traditional way of saying, okay, we've got to launch a big work on institutional reform of the EU, leading in 10 years to a new treaty that we will ratify in 5 years, and so on and so forth, leading us to the next 25 years. This is not at all what Macron has in mind about the reform. What he means about the reform of the EU is taking into account some policies, making them more realistic and changing them for the welfare of the EU citizens. Some of them have been implemented, for instance, let's say in the defense. So this is not something to come. This is something ongoing. And this is something where things have been done already. So it's not for in 30 years. It's for now and the forthcoming years. Let's say, for instance, in the defense field, we think that the EU is not reactive enough. So there was the suggestion of European intervention initiative. This exists. So this is an element of reform that we want to implement and that is going on. When we say that, for instance, when we conclude agreements with third countries, EU, we want them to take more into account the interest of the EU citizens, which means more reciprocity, taking more care of so I speak for France and Sam, I'm not speaking for, but this is the position we defend among the member states. We want them to be more reciprocal. Of course, our markets will be open, but we need to have access to also markets, public bids, for instance, in third countries. We need to have more elements of green fight against climate change integrated into these agreements. This is the reform what we mean. Does it mean that we have to wait 30 years? No. This means that when we negotiate agreements with third countries, France will not give this agreement to these negotiations if it doesn't include these elements. So when we say we want reform for the EU, this is an ongoing process, and I could take policy by policy. So it doesn't lead us to, in 25 years we'll have a new treaty. It leads us to an ongoing policy. What does it mean? You know that also, and Sam repeated it in the previous, there has been no change in the enlargement process. There have always been these requisites that any country has to implement the reforms and to access the EU. Perhaps in some cases, because the path before was more advanced than for others, it went quicker. But it has always been the case. So the reality is that there is, of course, this very strong commitment to EU integration, which means reform, and which means that it will lead to European integration. There has been this promise made in Thessaloniki. I worked in this Thessaloniki summit when I was in Paris, and this means that this will come, and this will come also in parallel with the EU reform. So it would be very difficult nowadays to say which one is preventing the others from going on. I think the strongest thing that can be done is to have reforms conducted in these countries. And then the last point I wanted to mention is that the combination of this prospect of EU integration and this prospect of regional integration. It's not one to compensate for the other. This is the way EU has been working. This is one helping for the other. And I see that there are a lot of challenges in regional integration nowadays in these countries. It's very interesting to see that you can more easily go from one country to the other, going through the EU than going directly from one country to the other. This is quite interesting. And this is why there needs to be quite a lot of efforts made in regional integration. And it will go, and it goes with the enactment of the EU integration. This is what I wanted to say to start.
Thank you. Well, yes, you're completely right, but I was just going to mention, maybe we could come back to this later. Yes, there were reforms. Some of these countries joined the European Union, they're full members, but there's been a lot of backsliding. You know, it's not like, I have this feeling that there was this version of optimistic modernization theory. You go through the reforms, you give democracy, you get institutions, and then you become like us, and this is how it's going to stay. Well, it didn't work out that way quite, you know, in terms of, I don't know, this was discussed in the previous panel, like Poland, Hungary, corruption, whatever, Bulgaria, Romania, here and there, and not to mention some of the things that are happening here in this region. So the question then becomes, how does the EU deal with some of this backsliding within its own ranks? But maybe we'll come back to that later. So Ambassador Schieb, a couple of years, well, not a couple, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there was a high-level American diplomat I used to know from before, and I was going to speak about American-Serbian relations to a forum, and I asked him what I'd tell him. And he said, tell them we outsourced the Western Balkans to Merkel. And then the Berlin process got started. So perhaps you can give us the view on that and how that is working, and what do you see as some of the issues that have been raised?
Thank you, Professor Vujacic. Thanks for inviting me. Luckily, the Western Balkans weren't outsourced. Maybe on a couple of remarks. First, indeed, I think in your introduction you said that you have the impression that enlargement has somehow been taken off the agenda. I can say from the Berlin perspective, this is definitely not the case. It is still very much on the agenda also of Chancellor Merkel. And currently, the focus in Berlin, I think, is very much on the council, next week's council, when hopefully the council will decide to open accession talks with North Macedonia and Albania. As you know, the German government's position is clear now, after we had to consult the German parliament, and there's a clear yes for North Macedonia and a so-called qualified yes for Albania. And we think this would be a very important signal, but this also shows that enlargement is indeed still very much on the agenda. And I mean, regarding Serbia, the Chancellor met President Vucic in New York and Prime Minister Brnabić in Berlin in the last couple of weeks. We have more and more German business companies coming to Serbia, also coming to Serbia because of the EU perspective. I mean, this is also important to know. For German business, this is an important kind of, wouldn't say absolute condition, but it's important to know that this country is on its way towards EU membership. I think, of course, things should move faster in terms of reform. Of course, the dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina should resume as quickly as possible, no doubt. But I mean, and this is also a remark my French colleague made, and this is very important also, I think, for me to say. In this panel, we are talking about stability, regional stability, and we think the best way to stabilize this region is to provide it with this European perspective. And there's no contradiction between stability and reform, especially in rule of law, etc., etc. And we always have to make clear it's not the region, Serbia. We don't expect Serbia to do a favor to the European Union by reforming, but it's, well, Serbia and Serbia's population is benefiting from the reforms which are being undertaken. And of course, we very much encourage the government to go ahead with the reforms. And maybe one other kind of issue. I think, if I may say so, it's somehow, and also during my first year here now in Serbia, the image of the European Union, or it's slightly kind of, it seems to have almost sometimes a negative image, or it could be much better, I would say. Saying enlargement is off the agenda, or and the EU is expecting more and more, and this is, and we would say it's also important to create to convey a positive image of the European Union, for what the European Union stands for, etc., etc.
Well, while you're at that point, why is it so?
Why is it so?
Well, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, is it the media? Is it not enough done by the European Union to, in its public relations efforts, or I mean, just off the top of my head, what's the answer?
I mean, not only because Sam Fabrizi is sitting next to me. I think the EU, of course, is doing an excellent job. But it's not only to the European Union delegation, but it's also up to all EU member states present here in Serbia and in the region. But I also think this is what we do. But I think what our efforts should be complemented, so to say, by a positive message which should also be conveyed, say, by the government. And I think maybe more can be done, yeah, to convey even a more positive image. And I think it's also important to note that even before final accession, so many things are happening and are being done. And if you mentioned the role of Russia, China, Turkey, and it's also important to look at the numbers. And if you look at the numbers, I think it's pretty clear. Yeah, the numbers are clear. I think the EU and the EU member states are by far the biggest investors. They do a lot in terms of development cooperation, etc., etc. But the perception, I think, here in Serbia seems to be a different one.
No, I agree. Look, I know the numbers. I teach European integration, economics of European integration at the Department of Economics. So I know, and a lot of people here know the numbers. The question is, isn't this perceived at large? I mean, that's the point.
Let's discuss it. If I may, one last remark, because we are talking about regional cooperation, and the Berlin process was mentioned a couple of times. Indeed, we would also have how to formulate it. It's not, I mean, we think there is still a huge potential, and the Berlin process probably needs to get better, yeah, to generate more concrete results. On the other hand, things are happening. So we think the latest summit in Poznan was a substantial summit. Only recently, this transport community secretariat was inaugurated in Belgrade. We had the roaming agreement signed. So things are happening. Now we have, looking ahead, the next summit will be co-hosted by Bulgaria and North Macedonia. It will take place in the region for the first time. So I think there are also reasons to be optimistic.
Thank you. Thank you. Ambassador Lutterotti, you're from Austria. Austria is very involved economically in other ways in Serbia, and it sounds a little strange, but somehow both Italy and Austria consider sort of to be neighboring states, although they're not geographically. So give us a look at what are the major, according to you, the major problems involved in this stability issue in Serbia, in the region.
Well, thank you very much also from my side for the opportunity to be here. Kofi Annan used to say there cannot be development without security, there cannot be security without development, and there cannot be either without human rights. So I think you can use this also here for the Western Balkans. You need economic development, and I think this is something where we can have a very positive assessment. It was done throughout the day during also the morning speeches. There is positive development there. I think there is also a stable environment in the Western Balkans, and I think the third part is the rule of law, and this is something that is being, or we hope is being tackled now. I think there is there's some certainly some room for strengthening the efforts, but I think that is something that the EU is very much focused on, and there you can get sort of I think the stability challenge addressed. Now, but I agree with what my colleagues have said already, and also a lot has been said in the previous panel. We also think that the EU accession perspective is still the best instrument at hand to transform the Western Balkans and make it a stable, prosperous place. The issue of credibility has been mentioned. Credibility goes both ways. I think we need credible reforms in the accession countries, but also we need to give credible messages towards the region. And for us, and this is the very clear Austrian position, one important element will be to grant the open accession negotiations with Northern Macedonia and Albania next Monday, to take the decision to do it next Monday, because I think there really we have the credibility of the Union is at stake. The other thing, and I'm speaking here also from an Austrian perspective, what I think is important and is to increase the political engagement, the personal engagement. Our bilateral relations are really excellent, and they have improved over the years, also because we have increased the level of high-level engagement. And by that I mean visits by ministers, by heads of state, government, coming here, being here, traveling the region,